21 Academy Award nominations, 3 Oscars, more than 45 years at the top of Hollywood. In an industry that swallowed stars like Marilyn Monroe, Judy Garland, and countless others before 40, Meryl Streep never had a public breakdown. Not one rehab headline. Not one career-ending scandal. While careers collapsed around her, hers only expanded. The real shock isn't that she became the greatest actress of her generation. The real shock is this. How do you survive 5 decades in Hollywood without ever visibly falling apart? Between 1979 and 1983, Meryl Streep did something almost no actor had done before. In just 5 years, she received 5 Academy Award nominations. 2 of them turned into wins before she was 35. Kramer vs. Kramer in 1980. Sophie's Choice in 1983. The numbers kept growing. Over the next 4 decades, the total reached 21 Oscar nominations, more than any performer in film history. 3 wins, dozens of iconic roles. Directors began rewriting characters with her in mind. Young actresses were introduced in headlines as the next Meryl Streep. Critics describe her as the most technically gifted actress of her generation. But behind the statistics, something stranger was happening. Hollywood is built on implosions. Brilliant careers rising fast and collapsing even faster. Yet while that cycle continued around her, Meryl Streep remained almost unerringly stable. No public meltdowns. No addiction spiral. No tabloid catastrophes. The industry called it discipline. The public called it professionalism. But the deeper question remained quietly unresolved. When someone survives decades of pressure without ever visibly breaking, is that strength or a different kind of silence? Meryl Streep was born on June 22, 1949, in Summit, New Jersey. Her father, Harry William Streep Jr., worked as a pharmaceutical executive. Her mother, Mary Wilkinson Streep, had once studied art and design and carried a strong personality that shaped the household. Unlike many future stars whose biographies begin with chaos or deprivation, Streep grew up in a stable middle-class environment. The house was orderly. Expectations were clear. Education mattered. Discipline mattered. Achievement mattered. Her mother believed deeply in confidence as a survival tool. She often told her daughter that she was capable of anything if she worked hard enough. It was encouragement, but it also planted a quiet form of pressure. Success was not framed as a distant dream. It was presented as a natural outcome of effort. That idea followed Streep through every stage of her life. If something failed, the assumption was not that it was impossible, but that more work was required. During her teenage years at Barnard High School, she was not yet the intense figure critics would later describe. She was social, outgoing, even playful. She sang in school productions and briefly leaned toward musical theater rather than heavy drama. Friends remember her as charismatic and confident, someone who enjoyed attention but never seemed desperate for it. Yet even in those early performances, there was an unusual level of preparation. She memorized material quickly. She rehearsed obsessively. She preferred arriving on stage completely ready rather than discovering emotion spontaneously. That instinct for preparation deepened when she entered Vassar College in the late 1960s. The cultural atmosphere of the time was turbulent. Protests, political debates, artistic experimentation. But Streep's approach remained disciplined. She shifted away from lighter musical roles and began studying classical theater more seriously. Shakespeare and European drama demanded technical precision, voice control, and emotional range. Instead of chasing popularity on campus, she chased mastery. After graduating from Vassar, she was accepted into the Yale School of Drama, one of the most competitive acting programs in the United States. Yale intensified everything. Students performed constantly, sometimes appearing in multiple productions each semester. The training emphasized technique, structure, and psychological depth. Actors learned not only how to express emotion, but how to control it, when to release it, when to restrain it, and how to repeat it night after night with consistency. Money during those years was limited. Streep worked small jobs to support herself, including waitressing and typing manuscripts. But financial struggle was not the defining challenge. The real pressure came from the environment itself. Every student in the program had been exceptional somewhere else. At Yale, Excellence was simply the baseline. In that atmosphere, Streep refined the habits that would later define her career. She studied dialects carefully, listening to recordings and repeating sounds until they became natural. She analyzed scripts line by line, mapping emotional shifts like a mathematician studying patterns. Directors noticed that she rarely relied on improvisation or instinct alone. Instead, she built performances piece by piece, constructing emotional architecture beneath every scene. By the early 1970s, when she moved to New York to pursue professional theater, the foundation was already clear. She was not an actor who depended on raw charisma or unpredictable emotion. She was an actor built on preparation, discipline, and control. That control allowed her to perform consistently under pressure. It also meant she learned early how to keep personal feelings separate from public work. Long before Hollywood labeled her unbreakable, she had already trained herself to operate that way. Emotion would exist, but it would be directed, contained, and used with precision. On stage and later on camera, vulnerability could appear authentic because it was carefully constructed rather than chaotic. The industry would eventually interpret this as professionalism. Critics would describe it as technical brilliance. But the structure began much earlier, in classrooms and rehearsal halls where mistakes were corrected immediately and excellence was treated as the only acceptable outcome. If a performer learns from the beginning that emotion must always be controlled, what happens when life eventually delivers a feeling too powerful to organize so neatly? By the early 1970s, Meryl Streep had finished her training and moved to New York City, the center of serious American theater. Broadway and the downtown stage scene were brutally competitive. Hundreds of talented actors fought for a handful of roles. Fame was uncertain, money was inconsistent, and most performers survived on temporary jobs while waiting for their next audition. Streep did not enter the industry as a glamorous discovery. Her path was quieter and slower. She began with theater productions, including work with the New York Shakespeare Festival. Directors noticed her discipline almost immediately. She arrived prepared. She listened carefully. She rarely wasted rehearsal time. While other actors searched for emotion in the moment, she arrived already knowing the emotional architecture of the scene. In 1976, during rehearsals for Shakespeare's Measure for Measure at the Delacorte Theater in Central Park, she met John Cazale. He was already respected among actors for a remarkable record. Every film he had appeared in had been nominated for Best Picture. The Godfather, The Conversation, The Godfather Part 2, Dog Day Afternoon. For films, for nominations. He was not a traditional Hollywood leading man, but within the craft of acting, he carried unusual authority. Cazale was 14 years older than Streep. He was quiet, thoughtful, and deeply serious about performance. Their connection formed quickly, built less on romance in the traditional sense, and more on shared understanding of craft. They discussed scripts constantly. They challenged each other's interpretations of scenes. In a profession filled with ego, their relationship was unusually grounded. While Streep's career was beginning to move from stage to film, Cazale was already confronting a different reality. In 1977, he was diagnosed with lung cancer. The illness advanced quickly. Treatments were exhausting, and the prognosis was grim. Yet during this period, both of them continued working. When the film The Deer Hunter went into production, insurance companies hesitated to cover Cazale because of his health. Replacing him would have been easier for the studio. Streep made a quiet but decisive choice. She agreed to reduce her own salary so that Cazale could remain in the cast. Robert De Niro supported the decision as well. The film moved forward with Cazale in the role. On set, he worked through visible fatigue. Between scenes, Streep often stayed beside him, helping him manage the physical strain of the illness. For her, the path was becoming more private with each passing month. Publicly, she was a rising actress appearing in increasingly serious films. Privately, she was watching someone she loved lose strength day by day. The two timelines moved forward together, a career beginning to accelerate and a life quietly approaching its end. On March 12, 1978, John Cazale died at the age of 42. Streep was with him in the hospital. The loss was immediate and deeply personal, but unfolded away from cameras and headlines. There was no public statement, no dramatic interview, describing devastation. She withdrew briefly, then returned to work. Only months later, she met sculptor Don Gummer through mutual friends. Their relationship moved quickly. Within the same year, they married. To outside observers, the timing seemed abrupt. Grief, according to public expectation, should follow a visible schedule, but Streep never explained the decision publicly. She kept her private life tightly contained. This moment established a pattern that would define the rest of her career. Personal emotion remained private. Professional performance remained public. She did not invite the audience into her grief. She transformed that energy into work instead. The industry would soon see the results of that transformation on screen. But the deeper question remained hidden beneath the surface. When someone learns to separate emotion from visibility so completely, does the pain disappear? Or does it simply move somewhere no one else can see? When The Deer Hunter premiered in December 1978, the film immediately drew attention from critics and audiences. It was nominated for 9 Academy Awards and won 5, including Best Picture. For Meryl Streep, it marked the moment Hollywood fully noticed her presence. She received her first Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actress. She was only 29. The nomination placed her inside the center of the industry almost overnight. Directors began paying closer attention. Producers saw potential beyond supporting roles. What had started as a careful transition from theater to film was now accelerating. The next year intensified everything. In 1979, she appeared in Woody Allen's Manhattan, a film that became an instant cultural landmark. Although her role was not the largest in the cast, it reinforced a growing perception that she carried unusual authority on screen. She did not dominate scenes through glamour or spectacle. Instead, she created gravity through stillness and control. But the true turning point arrived with Kramer vs. Kramer. Released in December 1979, the film explored divorce, gender roles, and the emotional cost of custody battles in American families. It struck directly into the social tensions of the late 1970s, when changing expectations around marriage and work were reshaping domestic life. The film became a major success, earning more than $100 million at the box office, a remarkable figure for a character-driven drama. It won 5 Academy Awards, including Best Picture and Best Actor for Dustin Hoffman. Streep's portrayal of Joanna Kramer, a mother who leaves her family and later returns to fight for her child, divided audiences across the country. Some viewers saw the character as selfish. Others recognized a more complex portrait of a woman struggling against the limits imposed on her. In April 1980, Meryl Streep won her first Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress. She was 30 years old. Her acceptance speech lasted less than a minute. Calm, controlled, precise. There were no visible signs of emotional collapse, no dramatic expressions of personal struggle, just professionalism under the brightest lights in the industry. Then came Sophie's Choice. Released in 1982, the film demanded one of the most psychologically complex performances of the decade. Streep portrayed a Polish immigrant haunted by memories of Auschwitz and an impossible decision forced upon her during the war. The role required a flawless accent, emotional endurance, and an ability to sustain tension across the entire narrative. Critics immediately recognized the performance as extraordinary. Many described it as one of the most powerful portrayals ever captured on film. When the Academy Award ceremony arrived in March 1983, she won her second Oscar, this time for Best Actress. By the age of 34, Meryl Streep had accumulated 5 Academy Award nominations in just 5 years. 2 wins, multiple landmark performances. The statistics were astonishing. The rise appeared effortless from the outside, a straight line from talent to recognition. Yet the spotlight rarely shows the invisible pressures that accompany it. Every new role now carried expectation. Every performance was compared to the last. She was no longer just a successful actress. She had become the benchmark against which others were measured. And when someone becomes a standard for excellence, the spotlight stops looking for success and begins searching for cracks. Hollywood had already decided she was extraordinary. The question now was different. How long could anyone maintain that level of perfection before something finally gave way? By the early 1980s, Meryl Streep was no longer simply successful. She had become the reference point for excellence in American acting. 2 Academy Awards, 5 nominations in 5 years. Directors trusted her with emotionally complex roles that few performers could sustain. Critics treated her performances almost as case studies in technique. From the outside, the image looked flawless. But the moment an artist becomes a benchmark, the pressure changes. The industry no longer asks whether you're good. It asks whether you can remain the best. Every role must confirm the reputation that already exists. Every new performance is measured against your own previous triumph. For Streep, that expectation created an unusual paradox. The very discipline that had built her career now risked becoming a cage. She had trained herself to approach acting with precision, studying accents until they became second nature, analyzing scripts like architecture, mapping emotional beats carefully so that nothing appeared uncontrolled. This method produced extraordinary performances, but it also meant that spontaneity was often replaced by mastery. Critics began noticing this balance. Some praised her as the most technically accomplished actress of her generation. Others, however, started using a different tone. Words like controlled, calculated, and too perfect appear in reviews. The suggestion was subtle but persistent. Perhaps the performances were so well constructed that they no longer felt dangerous. This criticism revealed something deeper about Hollywood itself. The industry often celebrates actors who appear volatile, unpredictable, even self-destructive. Those qualities are interpreted as signs of authenticity. Streep represented the opposite model. She was disciplined, prepared, and emotionally contained. Her power came from control, not chaos. But control carries its own cost. Maintaining that level of precision year after year requires constant vigilance. Each role must be researched, rehearsed, and structured in detail. Each public appearance must reinforce the image of professionalism. There is little room for visible vulnerability. At the same time, the film industry itself was beginning to shift. By the mid-1980s, Hollywood was moving toward larger spectacle-driven productions. Blockbusters dominated box offices. Action franchises expanded. Character-driven dramas, the kind of films that had elevated Streep, were becoming less central to the commercial system. For an actress whose reputation was built on emotional depth rather than spectacle, this shift created uncertainty. Her performances were still respected, but the cultural spotlight was slowly moving elsewhere. Younger performers entered the industry with different styles, different energy, and a media landscape that rewarded visibility as much as craft. Inside this environment, Streep faced a different type of pressure. Sustaining relevance without abandoning the standards that had defined her, it required a delicate balance. Too much control, and critics would call her cold. Too much experimentation, and the reputation for precision might weaken. There was no dramatic collapse, no headline scandal. Instead, the tension remained internal, the quiet strain of carrying an identity built on perfection. The world expected excellence every time she appeared on screen, and excellence had become the minimum requirement rather than the achievement. When an artist spends years proving they cannot fail, the pressure eventually changes direction. The question is no longer whether success will continue. The question becomes something more unsettling. What happens the first time perfection is no longer possible? By the late 1980s, the conversation around Meryl Streep began to change in subtle ways. The statistics were still impressive. The performances were still technically brilliant. But the tone of criticism had shifted. Instead of asking whether she was talented, reviewers began asking a different question. Was she becoming too good at acting? It sounds like praise, but inside Hollywood it carried a hidden accusation. If a performance is too precise, too controlled, too obviously constructed, some audiences begin to suspect that the emotion itself is manufactured. Streep had built her reputation on preparation and discipline. Now that very discipline was being interpreted as distance. The irony was sharp. Many actors who lacked control were celebrated for their rawness. Streep, who possessed extraordinary control, was being criticized for it. Her ability to disappear into characters, perfect accents, subtle emotional shifts, carefully measured performances, created the impression that nothing could surprise her. And in cinema, unpredictability is often mistaken for authenticity. During this period, the film industry itself continued changing rapidly. The blockbuster era expanded through the late 1980s and early 1990s. Studios invested heavily in spectacle-driven projects. The kind of character-based dramas that had defined the previous decade appeared less frequently in theaters. As the market shifted, the space for intense, psychologically complex roles narrowed. Streep did not vanish from the screen, but the rhythm of her career became uneven. Some films performed well, others struggled commercially. For the first time since the beginning of her rise, critics openly speculated about whether the cultural moment that had elevated her might be fading. For a performer whose identity had been built on excellence, that shift carried psychological weight. Success had never been accidental in her career. It had been engineered through preparation and relentless work. If the environment around her was changing, then the system she had relied on might no longer function in the same way. Yet even during this uncertain period, there was still no public collapse, no scandal, no visible breakdown, no retreat into self-destruction. Compared with the dramatic arcs that often define Hollywood careers, her story remained unusually quiet. The tension existed internally rather than publicly. This is what makes the darker side of her career difficult to recognize. Collapse is easy to identify when it arrives loudly: addiction, financial ruin, public controversy. But there's another form of pressure that rarely produces headlines. It is the slow realization that the world around you is shifting while your own standards remain fixed. Streep responded to that moment not by abandoning her discipline, but by adjusting its direction. She began accepting roles that allowed more variation. Some carried humor. Others experimented with tone. The perfection that once defined her performances began to loosen slightly, creating room for unpredictability. That adjustment did not happen overnight. It required a gradual acceptance that control alone could not guarantee permanence in an industry built on constant reinvention. The strategy that had carried her through the 1970s and early 1980s needed evolution if it was going to survive the next phase of Hollywood. When someone spends decades building a reputation for never breaking, the greatest challenge is not surviving disaster. The greatest challenge is learning when to bend before the world forces you to. By the mid-1990s, Meryl Streep faced a quiet crossroads. She was still respected, still nominated, still considered one of the finest actors alive. But the cultural center of Hollywood had shifted. The blockbuster era dominated theaters. New stars were emerging with different styles, different rhythms, and different relationships with fame. For the first time in her career, Streep was no longer the undisputed center of serious cinema. And in a strange way, that change opened a door. When an artist spends years trying to prove perfection, every project becomes a test. Every role must confirm the legend that critics have already written. The pressure to maintain that identity can quietly trap a performer inside their own reputation. By the mid-1990s, Streep began stepping away from that trap. Instead of chasing the most prestigious dramatic roles, she began experimenting with tone and genre. Some projects carried humor. Others allowed vulnerability that was less controlled than before. The performances were still carefully prepared, but they no longer felt like exercises in technical mastery alone. They carried a lighter touch, a willingness to play rather than dominate. The shift became visible to audiences in the 2000s. Films such as The Devil Wears Prada revealed a different side of her screen presence. Sharp, ironic, even playful. The performance was still precise, but it acknowledged something new: awareness of her own image. Instead of fighting the legend surrounding her, she began using it as part of performance. The transformation reached another milestone in 2011 with The Iron Lady. Portraying Margaret Thatcher required the same discipline that defined her earlier career, but now it carried the weight of decades of experience. When she won her third Academy Award in 2012, nearly 30 years after her second, the moment felt less like a sudden triumph and more like the confirmation of endurance. The rebirth in her career was not dramatic in the traditional sense. There was no sudden comeback after disappearance. Instead, it was a gradual discovery that survival itself could be a creative strategy. She no longer needed to prove that she was the best actress of her generation. That argument had already been settled. What remained was freedom. The freedom to choose roles without fear of damaging a reputation. the freedom to accept imperfection as part of longevity. In earlier years, control had protected her from collapse. Now, flexibility allowed her to remain relevant in an industry that rarely permits aging stars to evolve gracefully. This phase revealed something important about resilience. Reinvention is often associated with radical change, but sometimes it emerges from a quieter decision, letting go of the need to dominate every room. After decades of carrying the pressure of perfection, perhaps the most radical transformation was simple: learning how to continue without needing to be untouchable anymore. By the 2010s, Meryl Streep had moved beyond the stage of proving herself. The argument about her place in film history had largely settled. With 21 Academy Award nominations and 3 wins spread across more than 3 decades, her career had become a reference point rather than a competition. Younger actors were no longer compared to her because they expected to surpass her. They were compared to her because she had become the benchmark. Longevity in Hollywood is rare. Longevity without public collapse is even rarer. Many performers who dominate one decade disappear in the next. Others burn brightly but briefly, their careers interrupted by scandal, addiction, or exhaustion. Streep followed a different trajectory. She adapted to shifts in the industry without abandoning the discipline that built her reputation. Her presence in later films often carried a double meaning. Audiences did not only see the character on screen, they also saw the history behind it. Decades of performances created a kind of cinematic memory. When she appeared in the scene, viewers brought their own recollections of earlier roles with them. That history deepened every performance without needing to be explained. Another part of her legacy lies in how she changed expectations for actresses over the age of 40. For much of Hollywood history, leading roles for women narrowed dramatically after a certain age. Streep helped expand those limits. She continued receiving complex roles well into her 50s, 60s, and 70s, proving that audiences would still engage with stories centered on older women if the material was strong enough. Outside the screen, her personal life remained unusually stable for someone at the center of global attention. Her marriage to sculptor Don Gummer lasted decades. Their 4 children grew up largely outside the glare of tabloid culture. Interviews with Streep rarely revolved around private drama. Instead, she spoke about the craft of acting, the structure of storytelling, and the responsibilities that come with cultural influence. This restraint contributed to mythology surrounding her. In an era where many celebrities maintain visibility through constant personal exposure, Streep chose the opposite strategy. She allowed her work to carry the narrative. The result was a reputation built less on spectacle and more on consistency. Looking back across 5 decades, the most remarkable element of her career may not be the number of awards or the range of roles. It may be the absence of the dramatic collapse that defines so many Hollywood legends. Her story does not follow the familiar arc of meteoric rise, followed by spectacular fall. Instead, it follows a quieter pattern: continuous adjustment, careful evolution, and endurance under pressure. If legacy is measured not only by achievements but by the path taken to reach them, then her story raises an unusual possibility. Perhaps greatness in Hollywood does not always come from burning brighter than everyone else. Sometimes it comes from learning how to keep the flame steady long after others have burned out. More than 5 decades after her first serious stage roles, Meryl Streep remains one of the most recognizable figures in modern cinema. The numbers alone are extraordinary. 21 Academy Award nominations, 3 wins, and a career that has stretched across generations of filmmakers and audiences. But statistics rarely explain why a story stays with people long after credits fade. What makes her trajectory unusual is not only the height of success, but the absence of collapse along the way. Hollywood history is filled with brilliant careers that burned intensely and then disappeared. The industry often rewards volatility as much as talent, yet Streep followed a different rhythm. Her rise was steady, her adjustments quiet, and her endurance almost methodical. At the center of that endurance lies a pattern established early in her life. Emotion remained private, work remained public. Whether facing personal loss, changing industry trends, or the pressure of constant comparison, she rarely allowed those forces to appear openly. Instead, they were absorbed into preparation, discipline, and performance. That approach created a paradox. Audiences saw some of the most emotionally powerful performances in film history. Yet the woman behind them remained largely composed and controlled in public. The vulnerability appeared on screen, but rarely outside it. For decades, viewers have watched her portray characters experiencing devastation, love, regret, and transformation, while the person performing them seemed almost immune to the chaos that often surrounds artistic greatness. Perhaps that is a final mystery of her career. Many actors become legends through intensity, unpredictability, or personal turmoil. Meryl Streep became one through consistency. The same discipline that built her performances also protected her life from the implosions that end so many Hollywood stories. And so the question that began with her rise still lingers quietly at the end of it. When someone survives an industry built on breakdowns without ever visibly falling apart, is it because they were unbreakable, or because they learned how to keep the cracks where no one else could see them?